What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So, I recently finished playing through Final Fantasy XIII for the first time. Despite this game's initially shaky reputation, I wanted to experience and play it through for myself, partially due to that reputation seeming to turn over in recent years. Some of you may be surprised that I did not opt to make standalone videos on Final Fantasy X-2 and Final Fantasy XII. I did play and finish those titles, but I came away from them not feeling like I had enough to say about them individually to warrant a full video in my usual style. That said, there are certain aspects to those games in particular that I think are relevant to Final Fantasy XIII, due in part to how X-2, XII, and XIII sort of evolve and experiment with certain systems on top of the typical ATB formula. In addition to this, there are a lot of noteworthy similarities between FF13 and a certain other JRPG series that was on the rise at the time. Not that there's anything wrong with taking inspiration, I actually find that a lot of these similarities give FF13 a very distinct flavor compared to a lot of other Final Fantasy titles. For those of you who are able and interested in showing additional support towards me and the channel, since this is a one-man operation, I do have a Ko-fi page for direct donations as well as the myriad ways to show support through YouTube. Thank you to those who have shown support thus far, and thank you to everyone else for your consideration. In terms of presentation, I think the most notable thing to say is that the in-engine graphics finally match the cutscenes pretty much one-to-one. The difference is not nearly as stark as it is in the PS2 titles, which, while not the most important thing necessarily, does make the shift between the two feel less jarring. Now, of course, there are some aspects to the presentation here that make it clear that it's a few gens old, such as some lower texture quality here and there, as well as certain animations being a little stiff and awkward still, but I was pretty impressed considering this isn't even a remaster or anything, it's just the original PC release of the game. Now, with that said, the PC ports of the 13 trilogy are infamously fickle. I didn't really get a chance to test this game out without the recommended fixes applied, but I would suggest looking into this if you have plans to play these versions, because even with these fixes applied, I still had some issues. The main one being that if my controller ever disconnected due to running out of battery or otherwise, my game would just straight up crash, losing any progress I had made since my last save. In terms of music, there are undoubtedly some great tracks in this game's OST, the main battle theme being a major standout, as well as many of the environmental themes contributing to what I would call an otherworldly kind of atmosphere. This is due in large part to Final Fantasy XIII being full-on sci-fi, and I was totally there for it. Final Fantasy at this point was no stranger to having sci-fi elements. In fact, I was kind of shocked that 12 had as much sci-fi stuff going on as it did. To see 13 follow up on that and go all out with the sci-fi elements, I thought was quite cool. An overarching aspect to FF13's story is just how melodramatic and exaggerated it felt at first, which normally wouldn't be worth noting because those two adjectives are typically pretty commonplace in the genre, but I felt it more so than usual here, to the point of finding it kind of corny at times. It felt refreshing to an extent coming off of Final Fantasy XII's, well acted mind you, but very dry tone. However, I think this game swung the pendulum too far in the other direction. This did become less of a sticking point the further I got, but they lay some of this stuff on really thick early on. The main terms that are used consistently throughout the game's runtime are fal'Cie, l'Cie, pulse, cocoon, focus, and combinations of those terms. There is a lot to dig into regarding these terms and beyond, but much of the game's storytelling in this regard relies on drip feeding you information about them and leaving other information purposefully obscured. And so I'm going to do the same for now in terms of avoiding spoilers. I like the fact that the game doesn't force out-of-character exposition dumps on you, but at the same time, the way the world building and lore was handled here made it harder for me to connect with what was actually going on for a good while. Particularly the scope and scale beyond the party being on the run for about half the game's runtime. There is eventually a point where characters begin to learn about things that are not commonly known in universe, which leads to some more direct exposition in a way that not only ends up feeling natural at that point, but also helped put me on the same page as the characters from that point on. A different point that I'm feeling less forgiving of is the sheer abundance of flashbacks for events that happened before shit goes down. I understand wanting to put the player directly into the action, but the more I've thought about it, the more I realize that I almost always dislike heavy flashback usage. I more often than not find it to be a very distracting way to give context for events currently happening. And while flashbacks are a way to show and not tell, which is a practice I usually necessarily advocate for. In these instances, I think I would actually prefer for characters to just explain what happened rather than physically flashback to it. While I could see some players enjoying piecing things together in the way that these flashbacks are doled out, I think for me it would have made it easier to feel attached to these characters if the 13 days leading up to the game's actual events were playable to an extent at the start, even though it likely would have been an early pace killer and wouldn't allow for much combat, because as it stands, I kinda don't feel attached to them. There's a tendency to harp on the same character flaws over and over again for so long, which I think is what turns a lot of players off from these characters, especially early on, even if said characters do eventually grow out of this. But regardless, I don't want to dwell on this aspect too much, because the next aspect I want to discuss is what will ultimately make or break your experience with this game. Admittedly, level design isn't the very first aspect I consider when thinking of the JRPG genre, but Final Fantasy XIII proves that it does in fact matter. You'll probably hear me say this a lot from this point on, but throughout the first half of the game or so, which for me was between 20 and 25 hours in, the environments you're going through are literally linear. And some of you may be rolling your eyes because this is probably the most infamous criticism levied at this game. But having now played it for myself, I would say this criticism is completely justified. There are a few reasons why I think this point is thrown around so much here compared to a game like Final Fantasy X, which on the surface at least is structured very similarly to this game. Firstly is the limited decision making that you have when going through these environments. Your options are typically limited between go out of your way to the dead end that has treasure or stick to the critical path. And this first half of the game rarely deviates beyond that. And the second reason is the lack in destinations, towns, dungeons, whatever it might be, which Final Fantasy X has in spades. In that game, you are not only on an overarching journey to an ultimate destination, but there are distinct stopping points along the way, which allow for a reprieve from what could be deemed hallway-like level design. In FF13, however, when a dungeon-like puzzle is thrown in here, it is extremely basic and hardly worth noting. It's usually just go activate these switches in any order, and then the main path opens up again. And of course, this style of level design does tie into this game narratively, in that the party is on the run for this stretch of the game, but it just goes on for far too long. And just because it has that narrative tie-in doesn't make it enjoyable to explore, quote-unquote, and maneuver these environments. With all that said, the environments in this game do infamously open up in the second half, but by that point I was so exhausted from playing the first half that it was difficult, at least at first, to relish in that newfound freedom. Though once I settled into this more open segment of the game, I did grow to enjoy my time playing it more. But at the same time, I'm not just gonna suddenly forget the first 20 plus hours, which had me feeling like I was forcing myself to play for the sake of making progress and seeing it through, rather than actually looking forward to my next session. Now, of course, the last major aspect to discuss when it comes to Final Fantasy XIII is the combat, which, to my understanding, for many people, is this game's saving grace, and is probably the main aspect that has lent to more positive discussion on this game in recent years. The combat here feels like a melding of older ideas, while simultaneously being the building blocks towards future ideas. For starters, each character has multiple ATB charges, and your various abilities cost varying amounts of ATB, as opposed to using something more traditional like MP, for instance. The most comparable resource to MP in this game is technical points, but these are reserved for special abilities such as analyzing enemy weaknesses and using summons. Your max TP is capped at 5 and replenishes based on your ranking in battles. In most cases, it's beneficial to cast Libra to analyze new enemies, which in turn allows for a faster clear time and therefore a greater TP recharge. So it's a very synergistic kind of cyclical system in that way. Summons can also be used to get you out of a tight spot in battle. I didn't personally use them a ton outside of mandatory instances, but it is a tool in your arsenal that's worth considering. And so given that technical points are the only limited resource in battle aside from items, which can be used at no ATB cost for the record, it in turn makes sense that your party is fully healed after each battle. This, in addition to a very generous retry mechanic, often puts the focus on surviving individual encounters rather than a sequence of them. For one, you can only directly control the party leader, and if they die, it's a game over. Your allies, on the other hand, utilize the auto battle feature, which is also an option you can use yourself as the party leader. Auto battle functions as you would probably expect. It selects from whatever abilities the character currently has access to. This can typically be enough to get you through most encounters in my experience, but it isn't always the right choice, especially when it comes to more supportive roles. This is mainly because you can only select one target at a time with any given string of abilities, which leads to the auto battle function and therefore your allies to oftentimes opt to cast cast a single healing spell multiple times instead of simply waiting for their ATB to charge enough to cast multiple at once. This is because you can actually start or stop a string of abilities early. You don't have to wait for your ATB to fully fill up all the way and then wait for every one of your actions to play out, which admittedly is something I discovered way later than I should have. And while this option is crucial in tight situations, the main problem with your allies doing this is that there is a more notable delay between actions when you opt to cast individual abilities instead of waiting to lock in multiple at once with a single string of ATB, which leads me to discussing my general distaste for JRPG combat that lacks direct party control. When I enter a fail state in a game, I want to feel like it's my fault for not playing well enough or strategizing accordingly, not because my allies were dicking around being inefficient. Even when there are systems in place to try and mitigate these kinds of problems, to me it often feels like just that, a mitigation rather than a proper solution. And even then, we're talking about a solution that has existed in the genre for decades to a problem that isn't an actual problem. At the end of the day though, games that use these generalized tactics over direct control are what they are. So the choice comes down to playing by their rules or not playing at all. And to that end, I'll relent and say, even though I tend to prefer JRPGs that allow for direct control of your party, the way the lack of party control is implemented here ends up working out in the long run thanks to the paradigm system. Paradigms are essentially customizable party role setups, each of these roles granting access to different sets of abilities in combat. To briefly discuss what each of them do, Commandos specialize in racking up damage and slowing your opponent's chain gauge, Ravagers cast spells to build up said chain gauge, Medics use healing spells as you would expect, Sentinels draw aggro to defend their allies, Synergists cast buffs, and Saboteurs cast debuffs. Each of these roles also grants passives to the whole party when they're active, and I'm sure there's other intricacies that I'm brushing past, but for the sake of brevity, that is the gist. And what this paradigm system ends up feeling like is another variation of swapping your toolset and strategy mid-combat, not too unlike Final Fantasy X-2's Dress Spheres and Final Fantasy XII's Gambits. The main difference being that paradigms change your entire party's roles on the fly in combat, whereas Dress Spheres are on an individual character basis, and Gambits often require much more menuing if you want to make changes during an encounter. Shifting paradigms is not only useful for fulfilling the typical combat goal of survive long enough to reduce the enemy's HP to 0, but is also pivotal in filling the aforementioned chain gauge. Each enemy's chain gauge acts as a damage multiplier. Attacking them gradually fills the gauge, which increases the damage multiplier and ultimately staggers the enemy once the gauge is filled. The multiplier can then be increased past this point, but perhaps the more important thing is coordinating your attacks with your auto-battling party members in order to continuously interrupt or juggle the staggered enemy while racking up damage in the process. This flow of filling the enemy's chain gauge, staggering them, dealing heavy damage while healing as needed, leads to combat that is perhaps even more pattern-oriented than your typical turn-based JRPG. It can at times feel like going through the motions, especially in this game's case since you can only directly control one character. Add to this that the most reliable solutions early on tend to be highly defensive and can lead fights to drag on when coupled with extremely high health pools. What I didn't realize until far too late is how useful paradigm setups like Triple Ravager and Triple Medic can be for speeding things along. It would have been great if these systems opened up sooner, as it would have allowed me more time to learn these things on my own instead of getting overly comfortable with the limited strategies available to me for the first 20 hours or so of this game's runtime. The biggest shame is that when these systems do finally open up, it can result in some potentially really cool encounters, but similar to the explorations, so much of that time spent prior felt like such a slog to a point that is hard for me to ignore when evaluating this game in full. The main reason for this is the extremely limited options you have early on. It doesn't give the combat the best first impression, since the early chapters can be easily breezed through with auto battle. Once you unlock paradigms, the battle system starts to show promise, and may even feel a little overwhelming at first, which explains the drip feed of options from that point on. The problem, in my eyes, is the drip feed of those options is so slow to the point where a lot of my previous criticisms start to come into play. For one, you're largely limited to set two-person parties, massively limiting your choices as far as party construction. Limitations can, of course, allow for a more tailored difficulty curve, and therefore allow for more opportunities to teach players through the encounters thrown at them, but whatever the game was trying to test me on during these sections typically ended up testing little more than my patience. Beyond this, the main progression system that keeps your options limited is the Crystarium, where you invest this game's equivalent to experience points in order to acquire abilities and stat increases. You're limited limited to a maximum of 3 set roles for each character during those first 20 hours or so, after which everyone gains access to the full suite of 6. Though it can take quite a bit of investment to get those newly accessible roles up to par with what you've been using up to that point. This is why, despite my gripes, I actually continue to double down on the primary 3 roles for each character. While I understand this continued to limit my options, I felt that having all 6 party members to pick from, each with a different set of primary roles, was all the variety I needed from that point on. And even though everyone ultimately has access to every role, the abilities at each character's disposal in said roles actually differ, which I think is a good balance between flexibility and character identity. It is possible this changes once you've completely maxed everyone out, but the investment that would require, coupled with the fact that you can't even max out any of the roles until beating the final boss, means that even if that were the case, this wouldn't meaningfully impact a typical playthrough. Final Fantasy XIII is one of very few mainline Final Fantasy titles not available natively on all current platforms. And while I would expect a hypothetical remaster to include all 3 games in this trilogy, I want to discuss some changes that I would like to see in this game specifically, should a remaster come about. I wouldn't expect sweeping changes to the structure or pacing of the game, but the ability to sprint with perhaps some more robust ambush mechanics would be an awesome addition. As it stands, you kind of just run into enemies to ambush them if they haven't spotted you, and it feels kind of awkward to me. Also fix that god-awful camera while you're at it, please. The ability to save paradigm loadouts for certain party configurations would also be nice. It began to feel pretty tedious having to manually swap them back to how I wanted them every time the party was forcibly changed for story reasons. Speaking of paradigms, can we please scrap the animation that plays when you paradigm shift for the first time in every single battle? I could never quite tell if it was actually delaying my ability to act more than subsequent paradigm shifts, but even then it kind of felt like it did, which began to really annoy me after a while. And lastly, the most ambitious of these suggestions, I think the option of having all roles available from the start, or at least from when paradigms are unlocked, would be a great alternative difficulty mode, somewhat akin to Final Fantasy X's Expert Sphere Grid. I understand this has the potential to break the early game open, but it in turn would also be easier to screw yourself over if you don't know what you're doing by investing into the wrong things. And of course, something like this would require rebalancing the cost of abilities for those roles, but I'm kind of hoping for more of a high-effort remaster here, not so much a half-assed one. Overall, I think Final Fantasy XIII has a lot of potential that wasn't fully realized, or at the very least, that potential is realized too late into the game's runtime for me to easily recommend it as wholeheartedly as other titles, even though I did come away from this game feeling more positively than I did during those first 20 hours or so. Now, of course, the next Final Fantasy for me to play would be 13-2. I will probably take a bit of a break before jumping into it, but I am very interested to see how it may or may not have improved on certain aspects of this first game that I had problems with. I of course want to thank my channel members and shout out Space Cowboy EXE at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe of course if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.